Hey, welcome to the Awakening webinar series, where we seek to infuse the movement with voices and resources and inspiration for today's challenges. I'm your host, Michael Gussman. I've got the pleasure of being here with Matt Ingalls, the senior pastor of Oak Park Church of God in Salem. Matt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks.
Nice. Well, hey, buddy, I know that most people on this call are going to know you and know you well. You've been in the district for many years now. You're a key person in multiple committees and boards in the association. But for anybody listening, give us a brief view of like your ministry history that kind of leads to the post that you're currently at today.
Man, quick version. So I grew up in Indiana in a wonderful Christian home, was raised by two beautiful saints, and kind of experienced the call to ministry in high school, ran from that for a little bit, but finally, after some things crumbled, some dreams crumbled, and what I was left with was my calling. I went to Anderson University, studied Christian ministries, and at the end of that journey, I was like, I don't know if I want to do ministry. I still sort of feel this calling, don't know what to do with it. And my wife and I moved to Jamaica for a summer, and we worked with an orphanage and school there. And God just like reignited all of my spiritual passion in that time. And then we moved, we came back to the States. We went on this whirlwind trip where we moved from Indiana to Oregon. And I just kind of fell into pastoring a church. I was 24 years old in Newberg, Oregon, and the church in Newberg was a small church, very neighborhood minded. It was perfect fit for me at the time.
Yeah.
We were really focused on what I called incarnational ministry, just a ministry of being in the nitty gritty of life with our neighbors. And that went really well for about 5 years. And then for about 3 years was really, really difficult. And I burnt out hard. And then we made the really difficult decision to resign and sold most of our stuff. And we moved into a truck and trailer, and we lived and traveled in that truck and trailer for 14 months, sought God's direction for our lives during that time. And the door that opened was here in Salem. Yeah. And that was the fall of 2019. And I remember at the time, going through that season of living in the trailer and literally moving through the wilderness and just having this sense of God never calls people to easy things. There's just no biblical story where it's like, come and do this easy thing for me.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of reticence for me of like, whatever's next is probably going to be difficult. And I had 6 months before the pandemic started, and life was kind of flipped upside down again. But man, there's been so much joy here in Salem, and
That's good.
Extremely grateful for the place that we're at now. So
that's awesome. Good. There's a couple of things I want to dig into, like what you said. Yeah. So go back to high school. You said you had a calling, and then dreams crumbled, and all you had left was the calling. Unpack that a little bit more. I'm really intrigued about that.
Yeah. So I was a runner, and I was ranked in like the top 10 in the state of Indiana going into my senior year for cross country.
Nice. Yeah.
I didn't want to tell you that, but but I don't know how to frame the story if I don't say that.
Sure.
So my head in my dream was, okay, I'm going to go to a Big Ten school and run cross country and track. And then after I'm done with that, then I'll go to seminary or something and pursue the calling. And so, again, here I am, I'm ranked in the top 10 in the state. And like, I didn't even qualify for the state championships. Like, my season was kind of terrible, and I choked at the meet where you qualified for state. And so there were no offers on the table. Like, there was no big school interested in me. And And so, yeah, like that whole dream just like turned to sand in my
Yeah.
hands.
Yeah.
There's a lot of grief, you're 18,
I bet.
17 years old, like you don't know how to frame all that stuff. But now looking back, it's like, man, that's the path that I got to walk was so much better, so much more full of
So good.
life
Yeah.
than the other one. So
That's good. How did you discern a calling? So, whatever
yeah,
happened before, and then here you are, sand, and now you've got this calling. How did you even discern that?
I think it's just a burning passion to help the
Hmm.
church, and that being a consuming passion, like I'm
Yeah.
not, it's not like, man, I really want to be an engineer and I also want to use my time, but it's like I feel like every gift I have, every everything that's in my toolkit, like I want to give to
Mm.
the church and I want to give to God's kingdom and God's people. Um and so it became pretty clear, I think, I was raised in the Bible Belt, so like you're like, okay, if that's what I want to do, then pastoring is probably what I should do. And I
Yeah.
think that was accurate for me, but I wouldn't say there was a lot of discernment about it. It was just like, well, I have this burning passion to help the church. The way you
Yeah.
do this is be a pastor.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
That's really cool. All right.
yeah,
So then fast forward Jamaica. You're
yeah.
in Jamaica. You're with your wife. You guys newly married at this point, or have you been married for a
We've
while?
been married. We celebrated our second anniversary while we were in Jamaica. So yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I mean, that's got to be an amazing experience. Had you had any foreign mission experience like that before? What were some insights that
Short
came?
term. Yeah, just the like short term stuff. And she had done more traveling than I had. That was only like my second time out of the country,
Yeah.
excluding Canada. Um, yeah,
Canada
and
counts.
yeah, yeah, sure. We were in the hills in the Blue Mountains,
Mm.
and um, I mean it's really wild in a very beautiful way, like bamboo forests and miles and miles before you get to kind of civilization. Just this little town called Catadupa, and we were
Mm.
working with the pastor and working with mostly the school, but some orphanage work too, and
Hmm.
then um, teams would come from the states and
Yeah.
we would host them and organize the work and all that sort of stuff in the community. And um, just, I think part of the reason my sense of call and my passion about the church had atrophied so much was
Mm.
because I wasn't seeing any sort of transformation. It's like
Mm.
Christ likeness is just not something that I was seeing in the church. So it was like, well, maybe the church is no longer the vehicle that God wants to
Mm.
use to change people. And in my most cynical days, like maybe God doesn't want to change people anymore. Maybe
Yeah.
people aren't interested in change. And the thing about
Wow.
Jamaica that just rekindled all that was we just would go through this journey with people. We had 5 days with them, and you could just see the transformation that God was bringing to
Yeah.
bear in
Yeah.
their lives and in the lives of the Jamaican folks that we were serving, and watching the way that Jamaicans were blessing and being part of that transformation.
That's
There's
cool.
just this whole new imagery of like, no, God's not dead. God is on the move, and I want to be part of that. So
Man, that's really
yeah,
cool. That's awesome.
yeah,
Okay. And then let's see. I guess what about, and you could choose any one of the parts, or maybe, I don't know your story well enough to point you in a direction, but who you talked about these two saints that raised you, but
yeah.
who maybe besides them were like key mentors, influencers, disciplers in your life?
Yeah, I have been so lucky with mentors. I've had so many
Hmm,
really wonderful coaches, in the
that's good.
faith. My youth pastor, when I was in high school and middle school, very graciously would take me to breakfast about once a month and
Yeah,
just entertain all of my questions because
so
I
good.
don't, that's just who I am. I have to understand.
Yeah.
And uh, and then um, in college, I had several wonderful professors and a guy named Stuart Ernie, who was the
Hmm.
director of campus ministry at Anderson. he just he just encouraged me so much, and I would sit down with him often, and he would just listen to my doubts, listen to my shames, listen, all those sorts of
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah.
then my when I started my ordination process, I was lucky enough to have a man by the name of Don Collins as my mentor, and he
Okay.
was the campus pastor at Anderson in the '90s, but he was the outreach pastor at Park Place Church of God in the '80s, maybe '70s and
Okay.
'80s, and was instrumental in that church, which at the time was, one of the flagship congregations of the Church of
Yeah.
God, just having their fingers in every good thing that was going on in Anderson.
So good.
And so yeah, just such a rich time with him. Couple of years of meetings, of sitting down and sipping coffee and just sitting at his feet and thinking about ministry and what that looks like.
That's
And I've
good.
continued, I'm very I, I'm very interested at sitting at the feet of those who are further along the
Yeah.
journey. Those are
Yeah.
some of the pillars of my
That's
faith
awesome.
development. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good rich thing. I don't know what that's like for you, but to be able to point out so many mentors like that or key people along the way, that's not always everybody's story. So that's a rich resource right there. That's really great.
Yeah, for sure. I think I hope, and I feel a burden to continue that story
Yeah,
because I know it's not everybody's story. And it's kind of heartbreaking when I meet a
yeah,
pastor who has not had that kind of mentorship and feels that isolation and feels alone. So anyway,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
that's good. Yeah, I think I show up on the opposite side of the table. A lot of my passion and desire to influence, mentor, disciple others is because of a lack in my life. And then once I got it, it was like, oh, this is what I've been waiting for. And so then
Yeah.
equipped to be able to do that same thing. Hey,
Yeah.
just one other thread in that, and I guess I'm pulling too from other conversations I've had with you. Um, so my perspective, you seem to be pretty self-aware about what's going on inside of you. I mean, you're just like everybody else, ups and downs. I hear your stories of, from the sand and having the calling to the young pastor that you described. Um, I guess my question is, I'm assuming that you would say, not that you'd say like, yeah, I am a very self-aware person, but gosh, what am I trying to get at here, Matt? Yeah, through whatever transitions you've been through, whether it's been from the disappointment of the running not working out to the springboard of whatever Jamaica did inside of you that you've already testified about, the challenges in Newburgh. Um, what what's the thing that keeps getting rekindled on the inside?
Hmm. Oh, I mean, I I just love Jesus. I,
Mm,
I don't know how else to say it. Um I feel like I owe him so much. And I don't
mm,
want it to sound like it's just about obligation, but there's
mhm,
this real debt of like, when I was 12 years old, I had no friends. I was bullied to the point I was bullied to the edge of suicide. I remember sitting in my room and just wondering like if I jumped out my window, would that be high enough to end it all? Um,
mm,
12
mm.
years old, going through all that and just feeling like my life is not worth it. And then encountering Jesus and just it all changing
Yeah,
and um, experiencing that love. And then, when my mom died much later, again, experiencing Jesus being with, Jesus being around, Jesus holding me, and as the
Yeah.
psalm writer says, capturing my tears in a bottle, like they're
So good.
sacred, and when I, stepped away from pastoring in Newburgh, just that presence of, so if the question is what is getting rekindled, it's that connection, that relationship with Jesus, and just believing that he is really, truly, and utterly,
So good.
um, the the light of the world, and
Yeah.
I want to serve him. So yeah,
Awesome. That's so good. Thanks, man. Thanks for sharing that.
yeah,
Well, hey, I want to turn from kind of the biographical stuff to we were at a recent district gathering and you were sharing a story about a ministry you guys recently launched. And what really intrigued me was the discernment process that you guys used. Do you mind kind of unpacking? And you've already kind of set the stage to a degree. Here you are, 2019, landed in Salem, 6 months in, global pandemic happens. Every busy thing that churches typically do is largely stripped away.
yeah.
And you guys, kind of enter into this discernment process, kind of fill in the gaps for people and provide some context for that.
Yeah, so Oak Park is, over 100 years old. We are situated on the busiest street in all of Oregon. So we have
Wow.
more cars pass us than, anywhere else that we could be situated. It's also a corridor for homelessness, drug use, and some other not great things.
Yeah.
And I think that the church, like most churches, there's a wrestling of like, we want to grow with certain types of people. We want to be a certain church in our head. And yet our location maybe is, maybe we might sense the location is like holding us back or something. And
Sure.
I
Yeah.
don't know, I don't know that we were, some churches get to the point of antagonism in that sense of
Yep.
dissonance between, we weren't there, but we didn't know what to do with that. Let's put it that way,
Hmm.
and the pandemic happens, and we've got all sorts of legacy ministries, right? Ministries that have been going on for decades.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden those things just stopped. And it was a huge gift because, as you well know, and as anybody who thinks about church, lives in church, works in church knows, stopping the
Yeah.
wheels is almost impossible in
Yep.
church. And so the place that our council and staff kind of came to was like, this is a moment for us to really discern, what does God want us to do when the wheels are allowed to roll again.
Yeah.
And um, and I think we didn't quite know what we were asking of the Spirit in that time, but
Yeah.
that was really our heart, was like, we don't want to go forward. We don't want to just bring back Sunday school because it's what we've always done. We don't want to just bring back, we did an indoor park for stay-at-home parents and
Okay.
caregivers. Like, let's not bring that back unless it's derivative of our calling, if it's situated within a love that
Yeah.
God has planted in our hearts for people. And so we welcomed people back in person to church after 5 months or something, but we didn't really start ministries back up. And I was really intentional of trying to pastor the congregation to join us in that endeavor of like, let's not just go back to what we were
Yeah.
doing because it's what we did, or because we feel an obligation to it, or we feel a duty to a certain person that started it a long time ago. Like,
Sure. Yep.
let's really wait on the Spirit. Now, I didn't really know what that was going to look like, though. Like, what does it look like to wait on the Spirit? I didn't necessarily
Yeah.
have any ideas about what that meant. And my wife and I got this great opportunity to be part of a cohort with a group called Street Psalms. And Street
Okay.
Psalms is a very urban ministry focused group that works with all sorts of different denominations.
Yeah.
And this cohort was a discernment cohort. And the
Cool.
driving question was, so it was a year long cohort, and
Mhm.
the driving question was, um, basically, what does the Spirit want us to do to bring peace and goodness to our location, right?
That's good.
And yeah, and there's this very, very specific design process that you go through this year. And one of the things I like best about it was like it was not ever said, okay, the spirit has to work by the end of 12 months. It was like, this is just a 12-month process that may
Yeah.
be a springboard for more afterward. But there was lots of really, really good stuff in that training process. My wife and we were just chewing on it every week. We'd have it,
Yeah.
8 a.m. On Wednesday mornings, and at 9 we would turn the Zoom call off and we would just chatter about, well, what does this mean for Oak Park? And what is, but one of the things that I think was most helpful, there were two things that I'll share with you that
Okay.
was most helpful for that process. One was the church ought to be acting out of love that comes from the Spirit, right?
Yeah.
Which means we have to wait on the Spirit to help us fall in love with somebody. The
Mm.
second thing is we have to love what's real and not what's ideal.
Okay.
Because so often the church is in love with the ideal location or the ideal people, and
Yeah.
we don't actually look at a complicated, sinful, and righteous and broken and messy and beautiful and dreaming creature created in God's image and say, I love you now the way you are.
Yeah.
We are kind of tempted to be like, well, I'll love you when you're like this, or
Mm.
I'll love my city when my city isn't wrestling with
Yeah.
opioid addiction, and my city isn't wrestling with litter, and my city isn't wrestling with, like, what does it look like to to fall in love with Salem as it really is,
Yeah.
because the Spirit has done that. And those two things really just completely reframed the pandemic for me, and reframed um the grinding to a halt. And I
Yeah.
was just like, oh, this is exactly where we should be. Like,
Sure.
because as soon as you start up Sunday school again, as soon as you start up the
Yep.
kids program again, is
Yep.
like, all of a sudden now all of your energy, both spiritual, emotional, and physical, all of it is wrapped up and consumed by
Yeah.
that thing that you're doing. And we want to be in a place where all of our spiritual, emotional, and physical energy is just open handedly sitting at the Spirit's feet, saying,
Yeah.
make us fall in love. And, concurrent with that was, like I mentioned, we are this corridor where, homelessness is prevalent. Like, you can't drive down the street without seeing folks camp, either just right off the street or even like on the sidewalk. And we have people who, come to our doors relatively often. And I think for a long time, our thought was, we're going to give folks a bag and then we're going to make sure that they know that they can't camp on our property. And that was our
Yeah.
approach to homelessness. And there wasn't any malice, there wasn't any anger or prejudice against folks. It was just like, this is what we can do and this is what we're going to do. But as we were praying pretty fervently for the Spirit to help us fall in love, um, I just began to sense other people changing their attitude as they went to the door to give food out.
Mm.
Um, and people who, for a long time, if I can use this language, were cantankerous towards
Yeah.
unhoused folks, suddenly being very compassionate and very
Mm.
empathetic and learning names. Um, and we had a time where a tent city basically got erected on our property, but it
Oh,
was
wow.
close enough to the road that actually, the way the law works, like, there's a public right of way that we don't actually have the right to evict somebody from.
Yeah.
And so, like, neighbors were complaining to us, and we didn't felt like we didn't have any power over the situation. Like, we could only really rely on the city to do something. And in that time, when I thought, like, this is just going to blow everything up, what I saw was actually radical compassion and a longing
Nice.
to know people and to sit with them and to
Wow.
not just look at them as problems to be solved, but to really love them in the real condition they're in.
Yeah.
And that was when that was like the light bulb moment, like, oh my goodness, the Spirit has done it.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Like,
Wow.
yeah, and there's more to the story than that, but that's the Cliff Notes version,
Yeah.
and also alongside that, a real conviction to be more involved and to fall deeper in love with the school, the elementary school that's closest to us.
Okay.
So anyway, those two things, we really, after the pandemic, after that discernment process, like we've just leaned into
Yeah.
loving house folks, loving our unhoused neighbors, loving our school, and yeah, I mean that's kind of
That's cool.
that's the process. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So let just nuts and bolts. So you're with Street Psalms. Sounds like you're meeting on a weekly basis.
Mhm.
Cohort language makes it sound like you're not the only one on a call with somebody. You've got multiples there. They're giving some kind of input. They're helping shape the conversation, but they're largely putting the discernment thing back in your hands. And you said, does that just happen? So you've got 52 meetings leading up to it. Just describe the process, the
Yeah,
vehicle they're using.
it probably wasn't quite 52. We took some weeks off. There was also like a learning lab in Birmingham that
Learning
we
lab. I like that.
yeah, so we did we basically did this immersion trip where we went and walked in the footsteps of the civil rights movement and
Oh wow.
we really thought about the way in which the Spirit engaged that movement,
Okay, good.
and um and the discernment that they had to go through under such really evil and oppressive circumstances to try and craft a movement that would make a difference and a movement that would really reflect the love of God. And Birmingham is a fascinating place for a lot of reasons, but during that learning lab, just like walking in those footsteps, going to Selma, walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, um, there's a I can't remember the name. I think it was Palm Sunday. There was a march in Birmingham led by several pastors, and they were met. They left from the 16th Street Baptist Church, which is where the bombing that killed four
Yeah.
girls, the
Hmm.
60th anniversary was just a few days ago. They walked up the street. They were met by the safety enforcement agents of
Hmm.
Birmingham, and the three pastors just knelt and prayed in front of these folks with dogs and batons, and and there's a statue in the park there of those pastors kneeling and praying. um,
Wow.
and anyway, it was just it was a really cool way to kind of put flesh on the idea of what
Yeah.
we're doing. I don't know that um, what we're doing in Salem is very different than what they were doing in the circumstances that they were under. But just being able to be inspired by,
Yeah. Yeah.
the Spirit is real, the Spirit is at work,
Yeah.
like follow Him. And it may be really hard, it may be really messy, but it will
Yeah.
always be beautiful. Um, and I think that was so that was a huge, very important piece to the cohort process. We had pastors from Kenya, from Ecuador, from Washington D.C., from Grand Rapids, Michigan, um, all over Guatemala. I mean, it was really cool.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I
That's really
really
cool.
appreciate the international voices,
Yeah.
just to get out of the echo chambers of the
Hmm.
U.S. Um, so yeah, it was really neat. They have a little guided thing that you would read through, and with questions, and then part of it was there's what they call a design process where you go through something with your leadership team and you
Hmm.
map the hurt, the heart, and the hope of your community,
Okay. Hurt,
your
heart, hope.
congregation, and your actual physical community. And so we went through this long process of like having lunch with different small groups in the church, and we would just
Yeah.
ask them about, what's the hurt that you see in the church? What's the hurt you see in the community? What's the hurt that you see in your
Yeah.
own life? And just trying to compile and map these different facets. And that's not necessarily so that you can draw conclusions as much as just like, here's the arena within which the Spirit is at work,
Mm.
and bring that to the fore of your mind when you're praying as a community. Study it, think about, who are we, what are we going through, what are these circumstances that are unique to us, and then what might the Spirit be saying to us in the midst of these
Yeah.
real and authentic circumstances that we're situated within. So
That's really cool. Okay.
yeah, it was really good.
Yeah. Okay. And then I haven't pushed into this yet, but the Spirit, like Church of God, is holiness movement rooted. We were Holy Spirit people before there were charismatics and Pentecostals. And so this is native language to us in our
Yeah,
roots, but not always in our current practice. And I've
yeah,
noticed now every single time you've described this process, this is very much spirit led, waiting on what the Spirit will say. Unpack that a little bit more. I mean, what does this actually look like? I get some of the mechanics. We're asking
yeah,
questions, you're creating a space, you're following in the footsteps of others. And I can see how all of those things would click. How is that spirit led? How is that inviting the Spirit? Unpack that. And maybe I'll even front load it. Here's one of the reasons why I think there's great intentionality with why you're using that language. And I think sometimes I hear other pastors use it, and it happens to just be biblical language versus intentional language. So dive into
yeah.
that for me.
Yeah, let me like rewind and think about my own story a little bit as an answer, because I think it'll be helpful.
Good.
Um, I I grew up in a very, I mean, we were Wesleyans, but we had a very high value on the Spirit leading your life, right? It was like every single little thing, like, you got to pray
Yeah.
about and listen and wait on God. And that got very muddy and murky for me when I was
Hmm.
a young man. I was like, I don't know what the Spirit is, and I don't know what just my gut is, and I don't know what
Yeah.
my, like, the difference between the Spirit, my gut, and my desires. It all just got so blurry that I just kind of shut that off. And I think that's a pretty typical experience.
Yeah.
We all know that this spirit language can be really abused, because if the Spirit's talking to you in your heart, you can just make the Spirit say whatever you want,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but um, when we were living in our trailer and going through the wilderness
Mm.
through that time, it just became so apparent to me that God was really doing something on my interior that I didn't have any
Mm.
other language for than the Spirit.
Yeah.
And it is a little ineffable of, like, I don't know how to describe it, but just this profound, marrow level sense that God is at work, and God is doing, and God is calling, and God is asking things. I remember really clearly, um, you know, applying for jobs because I felt this need to provide for my family, and just having this deep seated sense of, like, this isn't it. Like, you need to wait on my calling, and, like, you just, you know, didn't know what to do with that. I mean, but I wanted to obey. I wanted to follow it and trust that that is actually God and not just my flesh. And I think through that experience, just a lot of trust that um, that's real, that God is actually speaking and actually
Yeah.
doing, actually really almost in a physical way at work in
Hmm.
my life and in the life of others. Um, And so then, moving forward to our process and what does that actually look like? I think some of the guardrails to make sure that it doesn't just turn into,
Yeah.
Pastor Matt said the Spirit told us to do this, so we have to do it, is leading a group in a really consensus format, right? Like I wanted
Mhm.
the staff and the council to all be in. Like we were never going to do anything, even with one no vote. We're going to pray together. We're going to actually seek God together until we have a unified sense of
Yeah.
what we're being called to. Also, looking for, I think I think the Spirit often provides confirmation of things, either through open doors or circumstances,
Sure.
sometimes
Yeah.
closed doors, and trying really hard not to just go off the gut feeling, but so
Yeah.
doing it in community and looking for fruit, looking for open
Yeah.
doors, looking for, confirmation of things. And then I think at the base level, part of the reason the Church of God walked away from that spirit language is because, well, the historian in me is like, wait a second, Matt, don't say that. So part of it, this is not what I was going to say. This is the other thing. Part of it, I think, is just kind of the creep of culture, right? Like we wanted to fit in better with the world. So there's that. But I think the other
Mm,
part is a sincere realization that just saying we're following the Spirit doesn't always turn into Christ-like actions. And so then there's this, reaction against, well, we'll just forget that and we'll move into a very rational,
yeah.
holy, performative holiness that isn't rooted in that relationship. So the reason I say that is that I think we always have to remind ourselves that the Spirit is the Spirit of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
lands where Christ is. It
Yeah.
lands and pulls and uh, moves us in the direction of Jesus. And so anytime, you know, and so we have to be very clear. Part of the reason we call it a discernment process is we want to weed out and bring to
Yeah.
awareness where's the selfishness, where are the things that are antithetical to Jesus, where is the sin, where is
Yeah.
the things, like, so with unhoused ministry, you know am I doing it out of a desire to be the hero, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not Jesus, that's not the
Yeah.
Spirit. And having those conversations, having training, like we did trainings of really trying to say that to folks, like don't step in and think I'm going to solve homelessness. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's more than hubris. That's like making God in your own image kind of stuff. So
Mm.
anyway, I think that is a long answer to your question, but
No, it's good.
it's a deep topic. And I guess I'm just in this place where I'm deeply convinced that the Spirit is at work and alive, and I
Yeah.
want to follow him. And there are some practical ways to make it not off the rails, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. And then I'm going to push further in this.
Yeah.
Where do you feel like, and I'm not sure what language you would use for this, so you can use my words and then adjust them as you will, but where do you feel like you've grown in a greater intimacy with the Spirit through not just this discernment process, but it sounds like that desert season in the trailer was a key part of it. Where are you? It's not where are you now. I think even like what does that look like?
Um, it looks like every single time somebody asks me something along the lines of what is God doing in your life, it's the answer is always teaching me to trust him.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, really, like it just feels like once I kind of had profound experiences where I really felt like God was at work, like it all comes down to trust, right? Like you
hmm
either
yeah,
like, and over and over and over and over again, I don't want to trust him, you know,
mm,
and so I just feel like my journey with the Spirit is like, Matt, are you ready? Are you ready to trust me today? Are you ready to trust me this hour, this minute, this second? You know, uh, and that is, I think that has become like the foundation of my intimacy with God is just,
mm,
do I trust him? Do I trust him? Like my last sermon, I wasn't very happy with. And the Spirit is like, do you trust me anyway? you
yeah,
know, uh, or I have, my kid is 10 years old and he's starting to talk about things in the world that are terrifying to me. And it's, do you trust me, Matt? Like
Yeah.
it just everything, everywhere, there's this invitation to trust, which I
Good.
think is the foundation of letting the Spirit lead. And
Yeah.
that I don't want to trust God. Like that's
Yeah.
the default of my heart is I don't want to trust him. I want to
Yeah.
do I'm very drawn to that performative holiness in our heritage. Like, yeah, great. Let's all
Yeah.
pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and show everybody how righteous we are. Like, that
Yeah.
sounds pretty good. Trust and the Spirit are disarming and humbling and deeply uncomfortable most of the time. So,
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, hey, to land the plane with this conversation, and I think the things that will be helpful for others listening. You framed COVID, as difficult as it was in the pandemic, really ultimately as a gift. Like you said, the wheels ground to a halt. And that's not normative. Normally, the wheels have so much momentum, you can't interject without getting hurt. So now you've got other pastors and leaders maybe hearing this call and going, yeah, I'd love a discernment process like that, but everything is going on. Any wisdom, advice on how to apply something like that in a non-world stopping season?
oh man, my initial thought probably isn't going to make sense. So
Okay.
maybe I can pack it. But who is leading your church is such an important thing for that. Are you surrounded by council or elders or board people who are deeply committed to doing
Mm,
what God wants them to do? Because, yeah, you're absolutely right. When a pastor tries to slow down the train just runs over the pastor. Um, but I think even though we had the pandemic to slow things down, I was also incredibly lucky to be surrounded by very sincere,
mhm.
wonderful counsel that was willing to go there with me.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say I really want to emphasize that we've not figured everything out. We have our own
Sure.
problems,
Yeah.
struggles, and um, but man, I have so much confidence in the people that are in the room, and I know that so many pastors don't have that confidence. Somebody has been put in the room because they're an attorney and they have that skill, and
Yes.
they're not very
Yep.
interested in the kingdom, or somebody has been put on because they are related to the person who gives the most money,
Mm,
or all these other reasons. And so I would say, if you're a pastor and you're like, man, we need a discernment process, look at your board and ask yourself, is what I really need to do first is
mm.
either retrain or reshape the
So good.
church? Because I think if you have leaders that are respected and trusted, you can slow things down and lead the church through discernment, I think.
Yeah.
Um, but if you have leaders, who are there or tokenized and maybe shouldn't be there, that's and I don't want to minimize that. Like what I just said, reshape or retrain was some of the most difficult work that a
It
pastor can
is.
do.
Yep.
But
It is.
I think it's one of those cart before the horse things. Like if you can't go down, like we already said, like the discernment has to be communal. And so if
Mhm.
you don't have a community you feel like you can trust to do it with, you've
Yeah.
got to go back to that as kind of your drawing board and
Yeah.
what it looks
That's
like.
really good. That's really good. Okay. And then, no, that's really good. I'm glad you took us back there because just like what you had said, cart and the horse, I think that's critically important. The last call I just did, episode 12, was with Fred Douglas, and we were talking about a recent Barna resource that came out that used the word of systemic burnout
Mhm.
as kind of the culture that many pastors find themselves in. And you hit it right on the head by taking it back to this would be the first area to win in. Because, yeah, you've got to have the community context to process, to be able to do such a sensitive
Yeah.
uh, assignment. Um,
Yeah.
so, yeah, that's really, really good. Okay. What about anything else that, maybe my lack of knowledge or something like that is not prodding the question out? Anything else that you want to add to this conversation that you feel like would be helpful for others who are watching and listening to this?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I we've alluded to it, but you know, ask yourself the question: Who does my church love? Who do we love?
Hmm.
Start
Hmm.
there, um, because I think the world knows when we don't love them, when we're doing out of obligation and duty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Visitors know when we don't love them. Other people in the church know when they're not really truly loved, and it really is, that's the place where we start everything.
Yeah.
And if you want to do discernment, I think it has to start there.
That's
Um,
good.
in our process, we really did have a profound moment of me
Hmm.
asking people, who do we love? And we all just stared at each other. I was like, well, we don't hate anybody. Like, we're not a hate filled church, right? But
Yeah.
when you put that in those terms, and you
Yeah.
start to think of what does love mean, we just nobody had an answer. and
Yeah.
and that was a really cool moment, even though it was a little depressing.
Yeah.
uh,
Sure.
and it also, I could go on and on, but it also really, when we started asking that question to people who were not on our board, who were not in leadership, and they
Hmm.
also couldn't answer the question, then it really gave a whole, like, congregational buy-in to this process. Because it's
Oh,
like,
that's
well,
cool.
if we can't say that we are passionately in love with stay-at-home parents, maybe we shouldn't do this indoor park thing again, or we shouldn't do it until we are
Yeah.
passionately in love with, um and that just gave a whole new context for energy for the discernment process. Like,
Yeah.
because we said we weren't going to do Sunday school class. I remember some of our older folks who'd been doing Sunday school, since the dark ages. Like,
Yeah.
they like, wait, we're not going to do Sunday school, and there
Yeah.
was that pushback. But then I think once we started inviting them into the discernment process, and they also had kind of an aha moment of, oh, we don't do Sunday school because we are in love with it, or because we're in love with what we're learning, or because we go because of duty, we go because of tradition, we go
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
we're loyal to the teacher, and all these things. Like, yeah, maybe we should keep the brakes on and just wait together. So, um, yeah, that's,
Man. So
yeah,
good. Well, I feel like there's so much more that we could dig into and unpack, but I am cognizant of kind of the time frames that
yeah,
we've got for this. And so maybe after I get a chance to digest some of this, because there's still some these are questions that I wanted to ask when I first heard your presentation. I'm like, man, I want to know more. And so maybe after kind of working through this, I'll have even more that I want to return
yeah,
back to, because and here's why. Again, Matt, I think that self-awareness that I identified in the beginning, a willingness to do things that can be countercultural, counter Church of God cultural, countercultural inside of your church itself, and to hold that space for something like what you guys have walked through to happen. Man, I just really admire that leadership, and I think that needs to continue to be unpacked. And I think I'm not trying to say Matt needs to be elevated, but nonetheless, both the self-awareness, where I hear there's a frailty to you, biases that you bring to the table, and yet you went through and held those spaces. I think that's something that more people need to hear about. So thanks for that, man. Yeah.
appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for those of you watching and listening to this. We'll include links for many of the things that we talked about here for you to be able to follow up in. But thanks again, Matt. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks.